Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Faith Focus Weekly Discipleship Podcast. My name is Kevin Rognus, and I'm the Discipleship Director here at Faith Covenant Church. I just want to thank you for watching or for listening today, and to remind you that it's always helpful if you want to subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of our content, and also leave a review and let us know how we're doing. I'd also really appreciate it that if you have any questions, comments, concerns, things that you want us to cover in the podcast, I would love to hear that kind of feedback. So my email address is listed in the episode show notes. So check that out and send me a message to let me know any questions you have or what else you want us to cover on the podcast here. So today, we're going to be continuing a little mini-series about this book here, which is called Faith and Fake News, A Guide to Consuming Information Wisely by Rachel Whiteman. Rachel Whiteman is somebody that I know. I interned for a couple of years at Mill City Church in Northeast Minneapolis, and Rachel Whiteman is a member there and wrote this book based off of a class that she began teaching, I think back in 2020 during the pandemic. I think it was back then. So it's a really helpful class to help us as Christians engage with information that we see on social media or in the news in a wise and Christ-like manner. And I found that it's a really helpful book, so that's why I'm kind of taking the time over the course of a couple of episodes to go through some of the big points that she talks about. So last week, just a couple of things I want to cover real quickly. We talked about filter bubbles, or rather Rachel talked about filter bubbles, and how sometimes based on our search history, the algorithms that search engines use or that social media platforms use to give us information, they're actually crafting what we see based on our previous search history and what we do online. That means that we end up looking at different pieces of information based on our online history. We're not always getting the same information. It's really important that we know that. Whiteman also talked about the difference between misinformation, which is something that's either out of context or incorrect or both, and usually that's done unintentionally. And then disinformation. Disinformation is something that's intentionally misleading. Misinformation can be by accident. Somebody didn't intend to mislead anybody, but disinformation is intentional. It's an important thing to kind of note that distinction. So today we're going to continue the conversation in the book and look at the second part of the book where she writes about evaluating information and gets really, really practical. So I really appreciate how practical this piece gets. And the first part of this kind of took me by surprise because she wrote about how we need to notice our emotions. And she writes, as Christians, noticing more nuances in ourselves and our emotional state can help us behave differently in our online spaces. Our emotions are often information for us about our internal state, and paying attention to them provides us with additional data points for ourselves. So basically, our emotions are not necessarily meant to be a guide. Following our hearts can often lead us into a lot of paths that we shouldn't go down, but noticing our emotions does help us understand how we're processing information. So our emotions are very important to pay attention to. And sometimes as we think through things carefully and prayerfully, we realize, okay, these are emotions that are appropriate and that I should be following. But other times our emotions are leading us astray or leading us to behave in ways that aren't consistent with Christ. And so when we pay attention and notice our emotions, we just have more information about what decisions that we need to make. And Rachel found in the process of her research for this book that research studies have shown that anger is the emotion that travels the fastest and farthest on social media. Empirical studies have shown that anger is the most prevalent and most quickly moving emotion that can be tracked on social media. The headlines that grab our attention the most are often the headlines that have the most emotion associated, the angriest headline, or the happiest headline, or the most uncertain headline. Those are the emotions that, or those are the headlines that trigger our emotions, and often then it's our emotions that lead us into reading the story. And like we talked about previously, these advertisers and content creators, news engines, news media sources, they just want us to be on their pages, clicking on things, clicking through advertising. So they're more concerned with generating those clicks than necessarily conveying truth. So that's very important for us to know. And another thing that Rachel Whiteman notes is that misinformation and disinformation thrive on emotion. Those two things are misinformation and disinformation, intentional and unintentional. They are driven largely by emotion, because when we have a really emotional response to something, we want to share it. And when we share something that's mis or disinformation, that's how those things spread. That's how those things thrive and continue to grow. So when we notice our emotions, that's something that helps us create a little bit of space and separation from what you're reading or what you're watching, so that you can calm down before you react to new information. She writes that if Christians want to be different, this is one way we can act differently in online spaces: slowing down and bringing intentionality to our reactions. We can choose to engage in real dialogue, which requires a certain level of vulnerability that isn't necessarily supported in these online platforms. So this vulnerability that Whiteman is writing about really ought to include an acknowledgement of when you've gotten it wrong, and it's an opportunity for us to repent of something. If we realize later that we maybe shared information that we later learned isn't correct, we should be vulnerable and admit, hey, I shared this thing the other day on my Facebook page or on my Instagram, and I've since learned it's not accurate, so I'm going to take that post down, and sorry everybody, I got that wrong. So that's something that we can do to model Christ-like behavior in our online spaces. So it's really important to notice our emotions, because again, emotions are not always what we should be acting upon, but it is important information for us to help us understand how we're reacting and why we're reacting in a certain way. So, notice your emotions. Next, we're going to talk about a few different fact-checking tools. This is something that's really important, and most of us never get trained on how to evaluate sources and how to check facts that we see on social media, that we hear in presidential debates, that we see in news stories, those kinds of things. Most of us are never trained on that, and that's not your fault. That's just something that is, a lot of this is really very new. In previous years, maybe 10, 20 years ago, it was very easy to trust some of these news organizations. Doesn't feel like that's the case as much anymore. With social media being so prevalent and anybody being able to easily share anything with a huge global audience, it has suddenly become very important for us to be able to check facts. But again, not many of us have been trained on that. So, in a moment here, we're going to go through some of these tools that we can use to do some fact-checking. Now, it should be noted that fact-checking is a vital resource for yourself. Fact-checking should not be weaponized. You shouldn't be going out there and fact-checking everybody and saying, you're wrong about this, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. That's weaponizing that. Even if it's true, that's maybe just not the responsible, Christ-like way to go about correcting misinformation or disinformation. It should primarily be a resource for yourself so that you can make the best choices in behaving in a Christ-like way in these online environments. Fact-checking can also help you learn about other perspectives. Oftentimes, if you're really deeply ingrained in one political side or the other, it can be difficult to really understand why people who think differently are thinking the way they do. But when you start engaging in some of these fact-checking processes, it helps you understand where they're coming from. And that's a really important thing for us to do as Christians. We want to understand each other because when we understand each other, that makes it easier for us to love one another, which is one of the most basic commands in the Christian faith. So it's really important for us to be doing fact-checking on several levels. It can also help you when you're fact-checking to, again, like the first part says, notice your emotions as you're doing this fact-checking part. That's an important part of all of this. So what are some of the things that we should be fact-checking when we're engaging with things, either with news on TV or things on social media or things in a presidential or some sort of candidate debate? What should we be fact-checking? Well, you might want to start with something that elicits a really strong emotional response. Like we said, notice your emotions. If you read a headline or see a story and you have a really big emotional reaction, that might be the moment to pause and say, is this really true? Because maybe this seems too good to be true. I should check that out. Or maybe, wow, I'm really angry about this. Let's pause before I get really angry, because certainly there are angry things to be angry about in the world. But first, let's pause and let me check this to see if I should really be angry about it. So notice the things that give you an emotional response. And if you have a big emotional response, that's maybe something to check out. Like I said, you should check things that seem too good to be true. If there's something about the candidate that you don't like, that seems really embarrassing, like, oh, that would be, if only everybody could see this moment where this candidate does this crazy thing, then, we could expose the truth. Well, if it seems too good to be true, it might be too good to be true, and I'll have an example of that in a moment. You should often check memes. So memes are those things floating around on social media where it's a little photo or video clip that has some text over it. Those things are usually just kind of created by random people. We don't know if they're credible, so those are a good thing to check if you're going to be sharing it. You should also check out quotes that don't have context. So if it says that Vice President Harris said this thing or former President Trump said this thing, if it seems like a really crazy thing that they said, well, maybe it's just because it's taken out of context. Because maybe right before they said the crazy thing, it said, I don't think that, and then they say the crazy thing. So you want to make sure you see the full context. So fact check those kinds of things. You could also fact check really emotional headlines. Again, notice your emotions. If there's emotional language in the headlines, check that out. Pictures sometimes need to be fact checked. You may think, oh, a picture, or perhaps in some cases too, a video, it's maybe hard to fake that. Well, it can actually be a lot easier to fake, especially with the way things are going with AI. So you may need to check and see, is this a real photo from this real circumstance? There's also been many circumstances in the last couple of years where it's a real photo, but from a very different context than what it's said to be in a particular story. So don't always assume that just because there's a picture that it's therefore true, because sometimes pictures are used from a different time, a different location, and said to be a part of this particular situation. So check that out. And then last, a thing to fact check is anything that's a really big hot topic. So I'm not even going to give examples because we all know what they are, but there's so many hot topics right now, especially in this current election cycle. So if it's something that is just really prominent in the media and everybody's talking about it, you may need to stop and just check the facts about it real quick. So those are some important opportunities to be checking facts. So how do we start doing that? Well, Rachel Whiteman gives us a variety of tools that we can use to check out various facts. So the first opportunity is just some simple fact-checking websites. Things like Snopes.com, PolitiFact, or factcheck.org. Now, some people may say, oh, these fact-checking websites are biased. Certainly, anything made by humans can be biased because every human has bias. As much as sometimes people try to take their bias out of journalism or reporting or fact-checking, our bias is there, and we should acknowledge that. Oftentimes, however, these websites like Snopes or PolitiFact or FactCheck have a variety of people working on them, and so that helps even out the bias. Generally speaking, these three sites, Snopes, PolitiFact, and FactCheck.org, are generally very well regarded, just kind of overall, and they often give a lot more context and an explanation as to why something is true or false. They don't just say, oh, that claim is true, that claim is false. They say, here's why it's true, or here's why it's partially true, or here's why it's partially false. Here's where some of the things get iffy. Oftentimes, these sites will often also have links to other resources. So if they're reporting about an interview that one of the presidential candidates did, they'll maybe link to the transcript of the full context of the full interview so you can kind of read the interview for yourself. It'll also maybe then have some additional links to recent surveys or recent reporting on something that happened with funding issues or a bill that was introduced on the congressional floor. Things like that. So good fact-checking websites will be able to back up what they said and why they said it. So even sometimes searching something on Google can be a great resource to check a fact on. So recently I saw someone that I'm connected to on Facebook and in real life, but I saw someone post something on Facebook that was said to be a video of one of the vice presidential candidates dancing kind of provocatively in a leather, like, weird cowboy outfit thing. And I saw this video, I'm like, I don't think this is true. This can't be true. I kind of had that big emotional reaction of like, what is this? So I thought, okay, I should check this out. And so I did a quick Google search, and I just typed in the name of that vice presidential candidate and then the word dancing, and sure enough, right away I had multiple websites that were debunking this video. And these websites all debunked it in a variety of ways. They said, here's the original video, and here's the face of the candidate that was superimposed onto the video to make it look like that candidate was dancing. So it was a completely fake video, and it just took me about 10 seconds to do a little bit of fact-checking about that. So that's one way that you can look at and use fact-checking websites. Another tool that Whiteman talks about is a practice called lateral reading. And that's just simply a process of learning more about the organization that's hosting or posting this information, more about the author, more about the organization behind the author, and those kind of things. And to explain lateral reading, Rachel Whiteman writes this. She says, lateral reading is basically taking the time to explore what you can about the creator and their credentials before you take what they say at face value. It can provide you with context that informs you whether you want to read or watch the original content or move on past. It can also give you context as you engage with the original content. So basically, lateral reading helps you look at, is this a credible source? Like, what's behind the organization? What's doing all this? Who is putting this information forward? So an example I had of this was a couple of years ago, more during kind of the pandemic season when vaccines were still really being debated, and I saw a news story about the vaccines, and a doctor came on, and he was introduced as Dr. So-and-so from such and such university, and this person started giving their perspectives on COVID vaccines. And I was curious, and so I thought, okay, who is this person? So I did some lateral reading, and this was something that only took me a couple of minutes to do. I typed in that doctor's name. Their name was still on the TV screen at the bottom, so I typed in their name and the university they worked for, and I found that person, and that person was indeed a doctor at that university. However, what I found was that this person was a doctor of veterinarian science. They were an expert in canine cancers, so cancer in dogs. But they were being interviewed about COVID vaccines in humans. So that moment of lateral reading made me very suspicious of what they were saying, because I thought, I don't think this person has the expertise to be talking about infectious diseases in humans when their area of expertise is cancer in dogs. Certainly there's a lot of biology that is kind of the same for dogs and for humans, but when it comes to diseases and vaccines for humans, that's a very different thing. So because I engaged in this lateral reading practice, I was able to say, I don't think this is the best source of information for me. The next tool is very similar, and that's just simply to learn from the experts. We have to look at if the person is really qualified to be talking about this particular subject. What I found in this particular case, when I was watching some TV, I realized I don't think this person is the best expert to be talking about this. There are experts out there that do know a lot about human infectious diseases and vaccines, so it's probably better to go learn from them versus somebody who hasn't worked with the COVID vaccine, hasn't worked with human patients, and has expertise in a completely different area of science. So check out the credentials of anybody who is supposed to be an expert. Also, you can look at questions like, does this, and it doesn't always have to be, depending on the source, depending on the kind of story or content that it is, you're going to be looking for different kinds of expertise. So you want to look at do they have the education to be talking about this particular circumstance? Or do they have the work experience or the life experience to be talking about this? Do they interact with other experts in this area? How do other experts respond to them? These are important questions for us to be asking when we're evaluating information. Is this person really a credible expert to be talking about this thing? Now, sometimes if it's just a news story about something that happened and they're just interviewing eyewitnesses, all the person needs for something like that is, were they present at the scene of that event and did they witness it? If they witnessed it, then yeah, they're a credible witness about that moment, even if they're not even if it's like a young kid who doesn't yet have a lot of work experience or educational experience. But if they witnessed it, they're an expert on that event because they saw it happen. So just think through some of those things as you're engaging with information. The next tool that we'll look at is finding the original source info. This is really important for looking at context of things, especially with video clips being so drastically edited these days. Sometimes you want to look at the whole picture. As you're looking on social media, sometimes you're reading something that's only a summary of events. It's not the events themselves. Sometimes you're only seeing you're not seeing the whole video, or you're seeing something that's very heavily edited. Sometimes you're looking at something that's actually re-reporting. It's not the original reporting. Sometimes you have the original report from a journalist that was there or a journalist that interviewed a particular candidate, and then other people report on that original thing. And then somebody reports on the re-report, and then somebody reports on that. And so it can become a little bit of a convoluted web at times. So when possible, it can be very helpful to look at the original video or to read a transcript of the original interview, those kinds of things. That'll give you the whole unedited picture of what happened. It may take more time to go through that, but it's often worth it to see, okay, was this accurately represented to me by the summary that was given about this interview or about this situation? It can also help because finding the original information or the original video, the original transcript, can help us weed out some of those forms of bias that we'll talk about in a moment. When we are looking at the original content, you're not getting what some news commentator thinks about it. You're getting the original content, and you can make up your own mind about what you think. The next tool is to recognize bias. That gets talked about a lot, and certainly the news networks have their biases, and it's important to acknowledge that and be aware of that. A lot of people, though, today will say something is biased, even if it's just something that they disagree with. That's not necessarily what bias is. Bias doesn't mean that it's wrong. Information can be biased, but may still be accurate. We all have biases, and it's important to acknowledge that. I'm going to talk about a few different kinds of bias here. The first two are kind of opposing bookends of bias. One is implicit bias. That's biases that we're unaware of. So I may be unaware that I have a certain bias towards one demographic or another, or maybe I'm biased towards one political party or another, and I may not entirely realize it. That's implicit bias. Other biases are more explicit. It's directly stated. So I might say something like, as a Christian, I am biased to disagree with this particular bit of information. That's my explicit bias that I'm aware of. Another bias is confirmation bias, and Whiteman describes confirmation bias as the tendency to process information by looking for or interpreting information that is consistent with one's existing beliefs. This biased approach to decision-making is largely unintentional and often results in ignoring inconsistent information. So if you have a particular bias towards one party or another, you might end up looking for information that confirms what you already think. That doesn't mean that the information you find is automatically bad, but it may be a factor in what you're looking for. There's also something that we have to acknowledge, that there is media bias out there. A lot of media organizations do lean left or lean right. Those things are very real. She writes that most major news sources do have ethics codes to help them create journalism that is as unbiased as possible. So a lot of the major newspapers, news organizations do have some of these codes in place to help try to weed out as much bias as possible. That doesn't always mean it's not there. It is possible, though, to look up bias charts online and get an idea of how biased some of these sources are, whether they lean left, whether they lean right, whether they're more centrist, how factual their reporting is. You can Google some of those bias charts. You could just type in like media bias chart, and there's some different options. You could also go to somewhere called allsides.com, and that has one of those reports there about bias. Again, bias in news isn't necessarily saying that something is untrue. When a news source is biased, that's something we have to be aware of and how that colors our perception of things. The last thing I want to address is the difference between fact and opinion. That may seem really simplistic. We often feel like we know what fact and opinion is, but Rachel found some really interesting content that said there is a Pew Research study conducted in 2018 that showed that people are inclined to label facts as opinions if they disagree with it. That should be alarming to us, that a lot of people out there, a lot of adults, are ignoring the truthfulness of something if they disagree with it, and they're labeling it as an opinion. And the best way to kind of differentiate between the two that Whiteman says, she writes, facts can be proved true or false. Opinions can't. So that's something that's really important for us to know. We shouldn't just immediately assume that something's not true because we disagree with it. That should be an invitation for us to look deeper and say, is this a fact or is this an opinion? A fact can be proven to be true or proven to be false. An opinion can't be proved either way. So, that's a lot of information, but those are some very helpful practical tools that you can use to help do some fact checking. It's very important that we do that during this season, especially a political election season where there is a lot of incorrect information out there. As Christians, we want to be as Christ-like as possible, and that means sharing information that is true and not sharing information that is false. It's really important that we engage with some of these practices to make sure that we're following Christ as best as we can. It's not always easy. I just want to say again, this book is called, again, Faith and Fake News by Rachel Whiteman. It's available on Amazon.com along with other online retailers. A really excellent book. I strongly encourage you to get it and read it because there's a whole lot more that I don't get into. We're going to do another episode next week about some more pieces about this, so I really hope that you're finding this helpful and engaging information, and I hope that you tune in next week. So thank you so much for watching or for listening today. Have a wonderful and blessed day.